Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Hines. I'm curator of film at Museum of the Moving Image. I welcome you to this week's installment of the Reverse Shot Happy Hour. It's the happy hour for Wednesday, December 9th, 2020. Welcome if you're here live. Also welcome if you're joining us via YouTube. The Reverse Shot Happy Hour is something that we instituted back in the spring, and we are going strong here, entering into the winter months. And here at Museum of the Moving Image, we've had this association with Reverse Shot for a long time, and we're thrilled that we're able to do this every week with them. The three hosts of Reverse Shot Happy Hour coming out here and bringing on amazing guests in the film world. And it's been really valuable for us to be able to gather this way when we can't gather in our building. And we have loved the opportunity, though, to adapt and also to figure out exactly how to have this presence online, regardless of when we get back in the building, to be able to engage with you in this way. And so I'm personally grateful for our friends at Reverse Shot for doing this with us. And with that, I will bring on the hosts of Reverse Shot Happy Hour, the editors and founders of Reverse Shot, Michael Koresky and Jeff Reichert, and longtime contributor and filmmaker, Aliza Ma. Oh, sorry, excuse me, Farihah Zaman. I'm introducing one of our guests as I'm staring at the screen, who is also formerly associated with Museum of the Moving Image, in my own defense. But Aliza Ma will be on later. Farihah Zaman is here now.
Way to ruin the surprise, Eric.
Please forgive me, Aliza.
Yeah, the thing that I mind most is that you didn't allow me to introduce Aliza Ma.
I know. Well, I ruined it. Take two.
I'm flattered by the comparison.
Also, he's been doing this every week since May. He's got to, at some point, screw up.
Even Eric has a breaking point. And tonight we found it. It's Mank.
I have definitely broken.
We have pushed Eric to the limit. This happy hour.
Because we made him talk about Mank before we came on.
Oh, so you've already said the magic word.
Do I win something?
Well, everyone always talks about like Mank being some kind of a drinking game. We literally have drinks in our hands.
All right. Well, mine's water today, but I don't believe that that's bad luck. I think that that's bad cultural assumption. So here we go.
It's to your health. It's literally water.
Yeah, I'm going to be very hydrated as we Mank it up this episode.
Well, hello, Jeff and Farihah. How are you?
Hello. I'm Manking it over here.
I'm very tired, and not just because of Mank. I'm generally tired, but we're
world weary.
World weary. I think this week's topic somehow fits well into that world weariness that we're all feeling, perhaps. Which we'll get to in a second, but I wanted to check to see how you're both doing. How are you?
I'm in the loopy part of the emotional roller coaster, loopy in the loop. But I am glad we're talking about the subject that we are today. I think I think you should say what it is. It's come up in other episodes before, but hasn't been given its proper investigation or due yet.
Well, sure. Yeah, I don't know why I'm speaking around it like it's some sort of delightful secret.
it's usually the worst.
And everyone already knows if they've been looking at social media. So this week we're going to be investigating, is that a good term? One of the least loved of all movie subgenres. And it's interesting to think about why it's so widely derided, and that is the biopic, not the biopic, as some people call it. Even though I like that pronunciation because of the rhyme with myopic, I hear people use it a lot. I'm pretty sure the correct pronunciation is biopic. It's a biographical picture. I don't really know why there's much fighting about this. So that's what we're gonna say in this hour.
It's interesting to be talking about it right now too, because if we were in a normal movie year, we'd have like 3 or 4 of these biopics opening in theaters across the country, prepping for award season. And yet in this pandemic year, all we're left with is Mank.
Yeah, usually we have like an imitation game or a theory of everything, some truly abysmal movie that we have to summon the courage to go see so we can have an opinion about. This year, it's all about Mank.
But I think, Jeff, are you saying that usually we'd have more options, so there might be some that we can actually talk about as having succeeded as a work, or are you referring only to kind of the bloated Oscar grubbing end of year glut that comes out?
I mean, more the glut, and I guess I'm somewhat missing the glut a little bit, because it's sort of like where, usually in a year you build up a lot of ire and you can direct it at those films, and where are they now? They're just not there.
Well, the good thing is there actually have been a lot of great movies that you might consider biopics, but they usually deconstruct the form. And I'm not saying that there aren't really great examples of more traditional biopics. I'm a huge fan of Spielberg's Lincoln, for example, even though I would call that probably not a traditional biopic either. It doesn't follow the entire life of someone. It focuses on one very small piece of Lincoln's administration, of course, a very important moment. But I think that usually when we talk about the successful films, or the films that we hold up as the arbiters of the genre could be, they tend to take sort of an interesting back alley route into understanding what makes a person, right? Because I think the problem that we often have with these movies is that they assume some kind of psychological veracity, or they purport to give you some kind of emotional truth. And they so often function within these really strict genre frameworks that there's no room for spontaneity or reality or truth, even though some of the films that I'm going to be talking about do function within those kind of old, I actually really like old classical Hollywood biopics. And I've been watching some of them lately, and I find just that because you can kind of check your brain a little bit about the actual information that's being given to you, you can focus on the craft and the artistry and the beauty of the filmmaking.
Well, and I think that relates to a thought that I've had in preparing for this week around how I think it's the derision for this genre is similar to that of the romantic comedy. It's only so frequently poorly done because we allow it to be so as an audience. We have lowered all of our expectations about what we can expect. You hear over and over, I mean, it's just a rom-com, it's just a biopic, when in actuality, nothing about the framework needs to equate to mediocrity, right? Like a biopic is just a movie about a person.
A real person.
And sure, a real person, but that even includes, Michael, how you highlighted that in that part of why you think Lincoln works is because of its focus on a particular time period, and why nothing in the rules, such as they are not written, suggests that that's a problem, right? Like that. So the need, I think it's not just the sort of pretense of emotional veracity. I think it's that paired with that impulse to document everything. Like here's a race through the tent poles of moments that have been covered in the news or media already, because if we don't have those moments of recognition, we'll all just throw a fit. I think the idea of like looking away from a set line of events seems, I don't know, impossible for people, but it's usually doing so that creates something with more emotional resonance.
I mean, so often you watch these films, and I think about how several of us got together and watched Bohemian Rhapsody. Was that just last year?
A couple of years ago.
A couple of years ago that we watched that film, and it felt like somebody had read the Wikipedia page for Queen and just made scenes from paragraphs on a Wikipedia page. I mean,
Right.
It moves through with this sort of like relentless logic of event, and then event, and then event, and then event, and there's nothing about it that even feels like somebody might have lived.
I think it's...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I find that movie to be very emotionally hollow. And yet I'm actually answering my own question of like, why do we think we need to just hit certain moments and have this race through time and document already well documented events in order to tell the story of a once living or still living person's life? And the answer is because I think it still does it gives you a like false burst of emotion. So with Bohemian Rhapsody, which is a bad movie, I still had this moment where I felt teary-eyed because I was like, that's right. he was like a first generation person from an Arab country, and we don't talk about that enough. And look at him, you know, like coming into his own in this way where it's still one of the most applauded classic rock bands of all time. And like I still think about why it caused me to feel that way. I think it can rest too easily on the existing story. I think there's a laziness of like, well, people will get this, we can shorthand.
Well, yeah, and I think it's dangerous territory because you have a lot to answer to, right? Once you purport to be about everything, then you suddenly have to be everything to everybody, and then that's fair, that's unfair. Anyway, we have two wonderful guests to help us sort through these ideas, and we better invite them on because they're just sitting out there in the darkness right now, and I always feel so rude to keep them there.
Bring them into the light.
We're very excited about today's guests. They're dear friends, they're brilliant writers, they're brilliant thinkers, and let's bring them on. We have Aliza Ma, world famous programmer who works for Metrograph in New York and is also a writer, and Julien Allen, who has just appeared, who's a brilliant critic who's written for Revershot for many, many years. And this is actually a great week to have you on, specifically, Julien, because you are an Orson Welles aficionado, and that's how we first met you. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here.
Hi.
Hello.
Good to see everyone.
So
It's
happy.
very exciting to be here, or to be there.
I think it would be great to have you guys jump in right away because we've already started. Are we being fair?
Sure.
Do you have thoughts about why this genre is allowed to largely exist in mediocrity?
I honestly have no idea why I'm here. Cause like, I guess I was talking to Michael and we hadn't caught up in a while. And then he was like, hey, you should do happy hour. Cause you know, we're going to go on hiatus at some point. And I said, okay, yeah, I'm in. And then he sent an email saying, oh, by the way, it's going to be about biopics, which I would love to continue calling it biopics for the rest of the session if you're into it.
I mean, you can do it. We'll let you.
You let Aliza do what she wants, okay? Don't you tell her what to do.
But yeah, like they're the worst. They're the most poisonous genre of films.
Wow, much even more intense stance on this. I thought I was like, maybe I'm being I'm being unfair, but go on.
Well, I'm just talking in very broad, you know, the run-of-the-mill Hollywood contemporary crop of biopics are just, they're filled with a sort of nihilism that I find incredibly off-putting, because most of the time you watch even just the trailer for something and it just looks like, you know, a bad cosplay with like a slick production around it and just a barely veiled, you know, awards bait for the actor or actress, you know, trying to dress up as someone else. Oh, Renee Zellweger lost so much weight and she looks like exactly like Judy Garland. Like, I don't know about that, you know.
You've reminded me of that film. That's certainly on my list of terrible recent biopics.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're all horrifying. And I look at Mank and I'm like, who did they make this for? Like people who actually like Mankiewicz, or you know, people who are into like bro tourism. I don't know like who they made this for, and maybe Netflix doesn't know either because it's just like this headless monster churning out endless content.
Well, so two thoughts. One is I wonder if part of your use of the word nihilism comes from like the assumption of what an audience's desires and intelligence level is, that like this is all we have to do to affect you or reach you.
Yes, an empty vapid star vehicle, you know, with all of the dressings but none of the substance.
Can you imagine if we lived in a Hollywood biopic only world? Like if that was the really truly what dominated film culture?
Yeah, I mean,
it'd be very depressing. It's also like I haven't thought of it this way before, but if we talk about how like the preponderance of superhero movies is so that we can recycle existing storylines over and over, I guess the same can be said of a very standard approach to a biopic. It's a way of just recycling an existing story.
Exactly. Yeah. So that you can make more meaningless representations of the events that people already have recycled over and over again. Yeah, I mean, like, you couldn't pay me to watch Bohemian Rhapsody. And what depresses me so much is that, like, people do watch it and people write about it and people give it awards, and it just makes me feel horrible about liking cinema.
I watched it on a plane, okay?
Julien, did you see Bohemian Rhapsody?
Actually, I specifically protected myself from that one, so sadly I can't add to the sort of tidal wave of invective about that. Having said that, I did see Mank. I did see Mank, which you asked me to watch in preparation, and I did watch it, and quite honestly, I was frightened about this film. I was frightened to watch it because I knew a bit about the thesis behind it. As an Orson Welles super fan, if you want to call that, or enthusiast, I knew it was about reheating that old story about the creative force behind Kane. And so what I was most frightened about was that it was going to be good, because that would have legitimized that thesis some more. And happily, I was reassured on that front, at least. I think 3/4 of the way through Mank, I became relieved that Orson Welles had essentially been deleted from the story, because I think a way away from this story is where anybody would want to be. And in the end, they don't attack Orson Welles, they just ignore him. But in a very sort of sinister way, they sort of bring him in right at the end, having contributed nothing to the screenplay, to the film, to Citizen Kane in general, apart from a few phone calls where he's rude. He arrives at the end and tries to gouge Mankiewicz out of his credit, which is the opposite of what actually happened. So it's insidious in that way. But to be fair to it, it is a film about Herman Mankiewicz. It's not a film about Orson Welles. And as such, it has to be judged on that basis. And on that basis, I found it bloodless and turgid in the main.
Right. That's a very good way of putting it. I was actually, though, I don't want to stay on the Welles component because, as you say, and it's very true, he's incredibly non-central to the narrative. He's completely like fragmented out of it. But did you notice the strangeness of the performance and the inconsistency of the Welles voice as an off-screen presence, and when the actor Tom Burke, who plays him, who was so good in The Souvenir, so brilliant in The Souvenir, so miscast here, I felt like it must have been a completely different actor, because when I heard the voice over the phone, I said, oh my God, they got someone who sounds exactly like him. And when Tom Burke was on screen, he sounded nothing like him. I mean, it couldn't be further from Orson Welles.
Yeah, I agree. I thought they'd adapted his voice. I thought they'd altered it digitally at the beginning to make it, in fact, almost captured Orson Welles' own voice. And then in the end, when, of course, you realize that Tom Burke is barely in it, and when he is, he doesn't look or sound like Orson Welles, it just contributes to the overall conclusion, which is that they don't care.
Right, that it doesn't really have an interesting thesis at all, actually. But as a Mankiewicz biopic, which it is more so than anything else, what did it communicate to you about him that you could actually take away? Because I thought it was so dispersed across all these different ideas about 1930s Hollywood and the kind of tension between the more conservative studio bosses and progressive politics, like the Upton Sinclair election in California. And I found it to be just, diffuse. Like I couldn't actually figure out exactly what it was doing. And I'm not saying that, that could be my fault. I'm not even blaming the film, but I'm just curious.
I didn't feel it, I don't know if that was directed towards me, but I didn't feel it really ever tied him down or even tried to really. It tried to pack an awful lot in, as you say, and it tried to show up some of those aspects of his character, which meant he didn't fit everywhere he went, and he was a kind of maverick and a genius. We're led to suppose, and I'm sure that's at least partly true. But as far as himself, if we compare with some of the films that I hope we're going to be talking about later, there's absolutely no attempt to pin down the man, even the artist, in terms of how he approaches his art. Absolutely none at all. So what it is he travels through. The biggest takeaway I had from Mank is that he was a member, apparently a member of the Algonquin, and almost every other thing he said was witty and fun. As if that wasn't enough, all the other characters were just as witty, or almost just as witty as him, which was just bizarre. And I just thought distracting and artificial. So I'm afraid it didn't communicate very much to me at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up the fact that we're going to be talking about other films, because we probably should move on from Mank, even though I don't want to cut anyone off if they have any other nasty things to say about it.
Well, just a couple of things. One which we had started to talk about before is that, you know, it was really difficult for me to have any kind of feeling about Mank. For some of the same reasons that we're saying, the general expectation of what a biopic will be was on display here, where we're just racing through these beats. We're expected to laugh because he's so clever and funny. And normally the kinds of things that I would point to be truly upset or offended by, I can't even like get it up. I can't even feel upset at its nostalgia for a kind of old Hollywood and this continued conversation we have to have every December, where there's a slew of films that really glorify old Hollywood masculinity, but don't want to wrestle with the fact that that is exactly what they're doing and the actual thing that's at the center of the story. I'm having more feelings talking about that in this abstract way than I am in any way related to the film, which
Right.
I was like, well, that happened.
I mean, it's interesting if the movie, after I was done watching it, I was sort of like, wow, if this was a movie made about, like, assume Orson Welles had never existed and Herman Mankiewicz had never existed and Citizen Kane never existed, but Mank, this movie had existed, it would almost be passable camp for like 45 minutes to an hour,
Yeah.
like old Hollywood camp. But then there's still another hour and 15 minutes of the movie in which David Fincher's father, the screenwriter, sort of makes great pains to tell you exactly what the movie is supposed to be about. I'm thinking of that lovely extended sequence where they explain the Don Quixote metaphor and then jump into the metaphor of the organ grinder right afterwards, but just kind of like sucks the entire life out of the film.
Oh my God, I forgot about that.
The screenplay, sorry for it.
No, sorry. I was just bemoaning the organ grinder metaphor.
I was just going to say the screenplay could have done with a big Orson Welles red line through at least a third of it, and might have resembled something, but he just wasn't going to touch his dad's stuff, I guess.
Well, and I wanted to say, which I think can help us transition to that, back to Aliza's initial question of who is this for. I think that a lot of times biopics are operating solely on the level of nostalgia. It's for people who are are like, I just want to be back in that old Hollywood world and not have to think about what might be wrong with it. That's right. Like, what else is it for? And I think when you're solely reliant on that as an emotional response, it's difficult to craft something that feels meaningful or even complete.
Yeah, but it's incredibly high-minded to even think that could elicit any kind of emotional response.
True.
No, that it could contain any authenticity to elicit any kind of response, cerebral or emotional or otherwise. I mean, it's hard, like, watching it done in that. I didn't watch the film, but just I watched the preview of the film. As far as I'm willing to go with Mank.
It's
but
pretty representative. I think this is fair.
It literally just looks like cheap simulacra. I mean, it would have been more interesting if they tried to not make it look like an old film.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, because you can't have it both ways.
Where the sound was mixed like an old film. Like, I mean, why? Because
it turns it into a gimmick. And once you do that, then you can't really make any great claims to authenticity of any kind, emotional or otherwise, especially when you have Gary Oldman in the role. And don't forget Gary Oldman, his recent Oscar-winning role as Winston Churchill is one of the great, gassy, ham bone, bag biopic performances in recent years. So it instantly puts me in that Gary Oldman space. But Aliza, you do have some titles of biopics that you do admire, and we're going to move on to some of those. What is one of the films that came to mind?
Well, actually, Michael, I think you were talking about, old Hollywood films that really get to the point of portraying old Hollywood. And I think, this wasn't one of my selections from before, but The Bad and the Beautiful, I mean, would you count that as?
No.
an interesting biopic that came from Hollywood that's also about Hollywood. I mean, it's sort of loosely based around the life of Val Lewton.
Right. Well, it's interesting, right? Because it's all hidden. It's not outwardly a film. No one uses his name. It's not outwardly about anyone. It's more like a veiled poison pen, right?
Well, I just wanted to bring it up because it's one of my favorite films of all time. And to Jeff's point earlier, like, if the historical people were never existent, then the film itself would still stand as an incredible work.
Mm-hmm.
And a great comparison to Wells' film because of the structure of the screenplay. It tries to do that same Citizen Kane thing.
Yeah. I think that the biopics that really that have affected me the most are the ones that sort of implicit in their syntax is like this admission that you can't really encompass a person and their life and their work within the scope of a single film. So a lot of them end up, like, I think Michael made the comment that, they tend to be sort of deconstructions of the genre as opposed to reinforcements of the genre. So one of my favorite examples of that of all time is Stanley Kwan's Actress Center Stage, which probably doesn't come as a surprise to you guys, but it features Maggie Cheung playing Ranlin Yu, the silent Shanghainese movie star. But the conceit of the film is sort of like framed within the making of a documentary about Ranlin Yu. So within the diegesis of the film, you have the documentary that's being made, Maggie Cheung playing Ranlin Yu as a fictional character within the fictional conceit of the film, and also archival footage of silent Ranlin Yu films like Street Angel, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's a film that sort of unravels the sort of mythological character of Ranlin Yu, who of course killed herself very early as a result of, all the suffering that was brought upon her by the Cultural Revolution, but also, into sort of something about Chinese history and about performance and about, just the act of filmmaking itself. So it sort of explodes her mythological character into all of these different elements that then the film kind of goes on to unpack. And it's one of her greatest performances of all time. So, yeah, I definitely love that film.
Wait, you mean a film that's based on a real person's life should still be about something?
Yeah, imagine that. It shouldn't just be an elaborate dress up.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was actually thinking about Stanley Kwan just generally, because did he actually make other biopics? Because I feel like usually they're it's more fanciful. He's had many ghost stories, movies that are very, very meta, cinematic. Mm-hmm. Was that the only in his career? Was that it?
I mean, yeah, I think that was it. But he makes films that are very nostalgic, and I think that it's a different brand of nostalgia than the ones that, like, the middle brow biopics traffic in. It's a much more personal sense of nostalgia for the disappeared milieu of filmmaking, of old, Hong Kong in the case of Rouge, or old Shanghai in the case of Center Stage. So yeah, I mean, I think like there's a lusciousness to the way that he portrays these bygone histories, and through these iconic actresses, contemporary actresses of the time.
And by calling attention to that lusciousness, you kind of get away from the possibly poisonousness of the nostalgia, which can be a problem with some of these films, that they cast everything in this impossible, fanciful glow.
Yes, and then so it's like this very carefully crafted veneer that inevitably crack, if you're thinking about it for a second too long, which obviously everyone on this call do think, so they don't work. And then I think, Olivier Assayas kind of took that portrayal of Ranlin Yu by way of Maggie Cheung and kind of played around with the sort of like her persona on screen versus off screen to make Irma Vep, which is something that we can talk about at a different time. But yeah, to me, that's one of the most iconic biopics in my viewing history.
So amazing.
And then something else we talked about was Edward Munch by Peter Watkins, which is a very different film, but incredible. And I think part of it is that Watkins uses that sort of documentary style to portray a period film, and it feels like he sort of built up this whole world and then made a documentary within it, and it's so enthralling to watch, the life of Edward Munch and the way that and also I think, it works because it portrays him as a young man, and it's a fascinating period in his life. And also because it portrays painting on screen, usually I think that's a tricky proposition. Usually sometimes, it can just totally shatter the illusion of the film if you see a cutaway to like a canvas and it just looks like blobs, And I think it's a film that captures really well the artistic process of painting, which is rare.
Yeah, my favorite painting film of all time is the Victor Erice Dream of Light, or the Quince Tree Sun, which I'm not going to go into too much because it's not quite a biopic. It's kind of a documentary and sort of a narrative. It is about this painter's artistic pursuit and life and death, but he's playing himself, and it's not like the story of a great and famous man, really. But it's a great portrait of work. But yes, that's
right.
A great point about painting on screen. Julian, I wanted to ask, what was the first thing that came to your mind when you thought of a good biopic, if you want to go there?
Well, it's great. I mean, right at the beginning, we sort of started by saying, biopics are the worst, and that's what I've long sort of thought in a lazy way. And of course, you asked me to think about good ones, and the more you think about it, you actually start to realize that it's a little unfair. There are still some very good ones, but they actually sometimes go unnoticed. I mean, if you think about, try telling Martin Scorsese, for example, that a traditional biopic structure doesn't work. I mean, I counted 6, and I've probably missed 2, but I counted Raging Bull, Goodfellas, Wolf of Wall Street, The Aviator, Kundun, and The Irishman. Is there another one? But the key to all those films is that they're all Martin Scorsese pictures first, apart from maybe The Aviator, and biopics second. And then I started thinking about what's the difference? And I think there are 3 types of biopic. I think there's the cradle to grave, traditional exploitative push button, easy win kind of biopic, which we've talked about at length, full of traps that bad directors fall into and good directors don't fall into, apart from maybe with The Aviator. We don't have to go into that. And Scorsese was one of those people that could do a film like that without falling into the traps. You've got the second one, which is what I call the Peter Morgan formula, which is where you take a moment in history, a short moment in history, and you see it through the eyes of the protagonist. So the Queen, the Deal, Rush, Frost Nixon, The Crown, etc. And then you've got the third type, which is the type that I prefer personally, which is where the biography is a vehicle for something else, more interesting, more personal, more universal, often an extension of the director's own philosophy. Those tend to be the ones I prefer, which led me to the sort of one that jumped out at me first, which is Maurice Pialat's Van Gogh.
Masterpiece.
Indeed, and it's great when you talk about Edvard Munch and the act of painting on screen. Well, the first trap Pialat didn't fall into was he didn't try showing painting on screen. And in fact, he almost takes Van Gogh's genius completely for granted, and puts it to one side. And then he studies, for me, the difficulty of a genius working and being productive when surrounded by inadequate people, which I think is a struggle that Maurice Pialat himself had experienced most of his own life, or at least he felt he had. And consequently, it's a Maurice Pialat film. So you see Vincent van Gogh doing what Gérard Depardieu does in Lulu. He sits down and has lunch, he argues, he drinks, he gets irate, he goes away. He's a human being, essentially, and Pialat's fascinated by humans and people and what makes them interesting because of what's inside them, and not interested in ticking any kind of boxes, even going so far as to kind of almost not ignore, but almost put to one side the painting itself. and the film itself has representations of great impressionist paintings in a very playful and enjoyable way around the outside, but the rest is just Vincent just living.
This actually makes me wonder what you think. This is in sort of synthesizing Aliza talking about Minnelli with Bad and the Beautiful just now, and talking about Vincent van Gogh. How do you square Lust for Life, the Vincent van Gogh biopic, much more traditional Hollywood biopic that shows a lot of painting and looks like a painting itself in Technicolor from 1956? How do you square that with this question of that Pialat did something so extraordinary by not showing the painting, by abstracting the idea of the biopic? You can see with the same man, you have two versions, and maybe even the Altman, Vincent and Theo, you have two versions of Van Gogh that are equally valid, right?
Yeah.
In terms of approach. Are you a fan of Lust for Life?
Yeah, I love Lust for Life. And again, we talk about films that if the person hadn't existed, would you enjoy it as it was? Lust for Life's an example of a film that I would enjoy even if the person hadn't existed. It's braver to show the creative process. I don't remember being distracted or annoyed by it at all. I think one of the hardest things, just to tangent very quickly, is to show the creative process when the person you're doing a biopic about is a filmmaker. There's this awful moment in the film Chaplin where it's quite obvious that Chaplin is filming, played by Robert Downey Jr., is filming the Gold Rush and the sequence where he's dressed as a chicken and the house is going left and right. And it's one of the most depressing scenes I think I've ever seen. The difference, the chasm of difference between the recreation on screen and the reality. And of course, in that film, they make the fatal error of showing actual Chaplin footage at the end, therefore consigning the rest of the entire film to oblivion. And so, yes, it's brave to show the creative process when it can't measure up. And actually, fair play to the ones that try. But yes, there are valid ways of doing it. All those, as I said, traditional ones, something like the Wolf of Wall Street, for example, is a very, very traditional biographical film. But we don't remember it because it doesn't stink like all these other films we've been talking about. It's not cheap, it's not exploitative, it doesn't make obvious points like awful kind of celebrity cameo moments where it's sort of a wink to the audience that somebody famous just walked by. In Mank, he says, "This is Mr. Perelman. Do you go by SJ or Sydney?" There's really clunky lines that are trying to make you sort of think, "Oh, SJ Perelman," for the 1930s nerds. Those kind of traps, the traps of showing of making a film about a filmmaker and not being as good. I certainly think Vincent Theo and Lust for Life get away with it because brilliant screenwriting.
It is. Oh, I'm sorry, Farihah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yes, your examples all are films that don't rely on the fact that this is based on a true story as its reason for existing. And there's it's almost a joke of a trope when you see this story has been based on real people in real life, and it's like, okay, great, I guess I just can't wait to lower my expectations around everything else creative around it. But I thought of an example of a biopic that resonates for me, and that I believe I know Michael and Jeff and I have talked about it before, but A Bigger Splash is a film that I think is another portrait of an artist, which is interesting. And maybe my brain is in this realm because Mank is a film about the creative process that I found to fail on that front. But I actually think A Bigger Splash is totally dependent on the existence of the real person at the heart of it. It simply doesn't use that as the only approach to telling story. Because this person existed, here's an overview of events in their life that could be presented in any format. It doesn't necessarily have to be a film. It really plays with what it means to live and how that's depicted in a cinematic way. That is very much related to its subject, but has sort of other artistic thrust.
Bigger Splash is extraordinary. Just wanted to put that out there. And for anyone in the audience who might think that we're talking about the recent film by the
Luca Guadagnino,
that's not what we're talking about.
which is fine.
It's not even fine, but that's okay. I was actually just thinking, Julien, while you were talking about, because that's an interesting point about films ballsy enough to try to mimic other films or filmmakers not being good enough. I remember I tried watching that miniseries Fosse Verdon, about Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon, and I did not make it past the pilot. And the reason is that it recreates scenes from Sweet Charity and Cabaret, and it actually recreates the Hey Big Spender dance sequence from Sweet Charity badly. Like, it just changes. It doesn't even try to mimic the cuts or shots. The breathtaking hubris of doing that was too much for my brain to handle.
Why bother? I don't understand. That's such a waste of resources and energy. Why do that?
Well,
Why try to recreate this? Like, what? Yeah, I mean,
obsession with making facsimiles of things. I could, the whole time watching Mank, I thought, God, this is like a facsimile of a movie.
Well, and
making facsimile of movies for a few pictures now, but like this one especially with the burn marks and the dirt and the weird sound. It's just, what is going on?
why aren't there more biopics about not famous people, so that you don't have the burden of like, I guess I have to show the moment of how Freebird was written. Like, that's the music corollary to your example, Julien, of when they try to show these iconic scenes come off, and it just always feels like sort of a pale imitation. In this case, how that song was written. Again, I'm never saying never. I'm sure there is a moment that I simply can't recall right now in which that's done well, but that as a necessity of the genre of music biopic is such a waste.
Yeah, reenactments are a difficult proposition in anything, unless it's like National Geographic doing like reenactments of how dinosaurs met in the wild or something. Like, that's the only time when I'm like, okay, I'm suspended in this disbelief because I fucking love dinosaurs. But like, that's also because like we didn't know what it looked like, so go ahead and recreate that, right? Whereas like something like Mank, it can only look like a cheap simulacrum of an old film. You can see the bag of tricks, very easily.
And speaking of biopics about musicians, Aliza, you had mentioned ahead of time one of the most interesting ones of recent years.
Yeah, and this ties into Farihah, what you were saying earlier about, like this admission that there is no true story at the center of this. And what the film that I was talking to Michael about is I'm Not There, and implicit in the title is that, Dylan is sort of this absent center to the film. And you have all these different depictions of stories that we've maybe read or heard about Dylan, maybe some from himself, but he's such an unreliable narrator of his own life. And the film really gets to the crux of that, but also makes, I think some great images around trying to retell different things that, he's been through.
Yeah, I mean, Todd Haynes has an idea that he wants to communicate to people about his relationship to Bob Dylan. And I think that's why we can live in a world where Pielach can make Van Gogh the way he does, and Minnelli can make Lust for Life the way he does. They're very different films, but I think they all, they come from filmmakers who have ideas of what they want to say, as opposed to, not to keep harping on Bohemian Rhapsody, but like, it just feels like it's dutifully trudging through beats that it feels like it needs to hit.
Yeah.
Like, it's so exhausting because it's plot and then plot and then plot and then this and then this, and there's no space for any reflection, or there's no idea about why any of it's happening.
Yeah, though I do want to throw in, as I teased a bit at the beginning, I do want to throw in a little bit of a shout out for these classical Hollywood biopics that now, so many years later, I'm talking about films from the 30s and 40s, so many years later actually feel somehow abstract just by virtue of how much kind of knowingly artificial craft there is in it. I think at the time you would have said, oh God, The Life of Émile Zola, directed by Dieter Lee, who directed Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet, one of Jeff's favorite movies. Of course, it's Dieterle, who's an incredible filmmaker. But there's just so much craft in there, and there's so much attention to every single detail. And so I was recently watching, and speaking of somebody who was name-checked in Mank, because Mank is all about the name checks. The director Mervyn LeRoy, that old workhorse, is brought up a couple times in the movie. I had just watched a few weeks ago his film Madame Curie. So it's 1943, Mervyn LeRoy, MGM, star-studded biopic of Marie Curie and her relationship with Pierre, and it's all about the search for radium, and like they're all the way that it's done is so incredibly overly dramatic, but it's so exquisitely done. And Greer Garson and Walter Pidgeon, who play Marie and Pierre, are so super stylized that I actually felt like I was watching. Now it looks kind of like a deconstruction of the form by virtue of being like, the perfect version of the form. I just was so immersed in that world. But also, of course, anything from the 1940s in Hollywood. You just give me a black and white movie from the 40s, give me some shadows and some whispering on the soundtrack, and I get the tingles up the spine.
And I'm thinking of here, like, Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet, obviously, but also like The Magnificent Yankee, the John Sturges movie about Oliver Wendell Holmes. I mean, on paper, so tedious, but it just, it feels very designed to be somewhat educational in a certain sense, but like in the civic mindedness and the pace in which it sort of wants to impart these ideas about America and Oliver Wendell Holmes, it's just, it feels wonderful to sit with it for a while. It feels like what, like you're saying, these older versions of these movies, they allow you to just sort of try and experience these people.
And I was just sort of moved by the fact that MGM made this movie about Marie Curie in 1943, and there was nothing political about it. It was just a very careful, loving portrayal. Julian, I'm sorry, did I interrupt?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's almost as if it was films in those days were almost renewing acquaintance with Thomas Edison's desire for what film should be, which was educational. There's a certain degree of saying these people mattered. It's important you know about them. You might not have heard of them. This is a way for you to hear about them. And of course, you translate that to the 21st century. It's all gone a bit wrong because you're hearing the gossip and the cheap shots. But yeah, no, it's perfectly legitimate education, a way of educating people about real lives that changed people. I have a nomination, if I may, because I'm worried if we might run out of time. And I want to talk about a film no one ever talks about, and I'm personally hurt by this. And that film is Bird by Clint Eastwood. And I don't know why nobody talks about it, but it does touch a little bit on what we were saying about artists. And if you like, what it does is it says, I'm not even going to try and recreate, we're not going to try and recreate Charlie Parker and find the best saxophonist we can. We're just going to use Charlie Parker's material. And we're going to remaster it and make it amazing. And then that distraction to one side, it's not really a distraction because the music is sublime, incredible in the film. It's just a film that takes its time. And I was reminded again by Mank saying you can't put a man's life in 2 hours. Yeah, you probably do need 3 hours, and Bird is nearly 3 hours long, but you need to use those 3 hours wisely. And I think, Bird takes its time. It's a meditative film. The characters have got time to breathe. The audience has got time to think and feel. And so I just want to hang that there because a lot of people think that Clint Eastwood's first great film was Unforgiven and his last one was Bridges of Madison County. But before that, he was making things worth re-watching, worth taking 3 hours out to watch.
Is that the trajectory people think? Sorry.
No, I mean, that's the most narrow. That's the kind of anti-Eastwoods. They'll give him those few years. But not many people. You don't see programmed White Hunter, Black Heart. You don't see Bronco Billy that often. I don't see Honky Tonk Man at all. Bird is the next stage of Honky Tonk Man, if you like.
We have Gina Telleroli telling us right now that all Eastwood films are good, all of them. So just watch out.
Speaking of Eastwood, do we count Sully as a biopic?
Yes, Chris actually mentioned this on the thing. I think so. That's a good one.
Yeah, I think it counts.
Is a film about a real person a biopic? And if it's about 10 real people or 7, is the Chicago 7 a biopic? I mean, it's a moment in time, it's real people, it really happened. It's a funny one. I think biography has to be the main driver of the film, doesn't it? Who knows?
That's a good question. I feel like there are films with historical reenactments. And those can seem like Aliza was saying, very cosplay-ish, especially when you have multiple characters.
Don't try this at home kind of thing. I mean, I think the films from the 40s were firing on all cylinders in such a way that, they could do this. And there were so many, well-honed craftsmen involved that, you didn't have to worry about things coming off as being garish or cheap seeming.
I have a more recent example that I think doesn't get talked about enough, but maybe I need to rewatch it. I'm now, as soon as I said it, I started getting nervous, but the Bertrand Bonello Saint Laurent. And there was, and there was another Saint Laurent biopic in the same year, I believe, that was just fine. It was like everything that you would expect. And I think it's a good reminder that, like, even if it is a well-known person, even if there are beats in their life that are well-known, the reason why Saint Laurent works is because the treatment is of like, here's a human being, and these are sort of more lovingly recreated moments of their life that don't necessarily hit the marks, or it's not all about how this one thing was stitched in his studio. I mean, the scenes that are most memorable to me from that film are these very lengthy party sequences that are like 7 to 10 minutes, and the kind of electricity in the air between him and other people, and the sort of the potential excitement and promise in the room, which speaks to something else about this person beyond the nature of the work or their contribution to the world for posterity.
Well, it also, so what that points out, and which I think is missing, which I think is very true of that film, and which I think is missing from most biopics, is it's sexy. It dares very to be sexy. It dares to like make its actors, who, even though they're playing versions of real people, dares to make them sensual beings, which is pretty rare, because usually, like, look at Bohemian Rhapsody. The least sexual creature I've ever seen in my life is Rami Malek with those teeth and that hair. I mean, he's not a person. He's playing
a hypersexual character too, which is bizarre.
That's what makes the movie one of the reasons it's so heinous.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there's just straight up plot things about that movie that it's like, why would you strip him of this, like, of the parts of the story, like his, the reality of his relationship with his ex-wife, which is so much more interesting than they were kind of friends, and the reality of like how he enjoyed party, to party and was magnetic to people. It's just a number of strange choices, not just the idea that they weren't creative enough or something.
Right, but let's get to the point too, that like biopics about queer people, especially men, are usually completely denuded of sensuality and sex. So you have The Imitation Game, you have Bohemian Rhapsody.
I'm surprised, Michael, you haven't mentioned Caravaggio.
There's just too much time. It came up in the chat, and it was such a great.
I can't read the chat.
Great example. I mean, that's a perfect example. I mean, but Jarman is his own thing.
Great chat today, and I was about to say this and just looked over and saw Edo's is the Puppet Master a biopic, which is perfect for my thought at that moment.
One thing, I'm so glad that Aliza was talking about the Todd Haynes, the I'm Not There, because I mean, I think it's an extraordinary film, but I also think it somehow, it sort of like turns inside out the whole notion of making a biopic. And I think that the idea of, I think the ones that work better are the ones that lean into the idea that it's mostly mythologizing anyway. Like the idea that this is somehow like some strict biographical account of somebody's life, which is, of course, can work in text, but it's a terrible idea for a film. Whereas like the idea of like myth making kind of works. And so certain characters, I think, actually lend itself better to, like, Dylan is always going to be interesting, no matter what you do, unless you totally denude him of what makes him this sort of like shape-shifting figure. So sort of like Joan of Arc, is usually a really good character for a biopic, because like it's there's disputed history, it's a mythological creature, like there's a religious element of it, like it's always like and everything from like Dreyer's Joan of Arc, which is extraordinary, a masterpiece, one of the great things in cinema, but also like Bruno Dumont's from a couple of years ago, where it's just like text heavy and flat and kind of like oddly comical, and this is the same figure, and they both work.
I'm also thinking about biopics that, I'm sorry, I realize we're running out of time. Biopics that are so vivid and so iconic in their own way that they almost like usurp and replace the real persons. Like when I grew up, because of Lady Sings the Blues, I grew up thinking Diana Ross was Billie Holiday. Like I didn't know what the difference was. And I had seen that movie and I had heard recordings, but they became so interconnected in my head that I still see Diana Ross when I think of Billie Holiday. So I mean, that I think there's a danger to that too, right? But it goes to show just how powerful the cinematic image is. And
yeah, like Young Mr. Lincoln for me is that film.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I feel similarly about Young Mr. Lincoln.
And Steve Jobs to me and Ashton Kutcher, they're the same as far as I'm concerned.
And I'm never going to be able to think of Mankiewicz without seeing Gary Oldman now. It's just
oh my God.
I thought about Mankiewicz otherwise.
Everybody go watch the first 5 minutes of Jobs, the Ashton Kutcher, Steve Jobs. It's the funniest thing. It's the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life.
I've never watched it. I've been protecting myself.
It goes to the heart of the ridiculousness of the biopic. Watch the first 5 minutes.
Okay.
One other title I'm going to throw out there, because it's on the level of I'm Not There, and not everybody loves it because not everybody loves this filmmaker, but I think Andrei Rublev is worth putting out there too, in terms of just sort of again, instead of showing you the life of the artist, you're showing a life around the artist, which is a very, very, I think a safer route to take than to somehow represent that on screen.
Definitely.
So what should we toast to today, now that we've reached 7, besides these wonderful guests joining us?
I mean, Mank.
Make good choices.
Oh man. Quickly want to shout out the reverse shotters in the audience: Chris Wisniewski, Ashley Clark, Ina Archer, Ryan Swen, Ina Archer, Edo Choi, Nathan Kasub, and Susanna Gruder. And if I've missed anyone who's here under an assumed name, I apologize, but thank you for joining us anyway.
Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We're really drinking the Mank that we're drinking to.
More biopics about not famous people.
More biopics about not famous people.
What'd you say, Aliza?
To me, never watching Mank.